The porch, the letter, and the warning it was a Tuesday morning just past 7:15 a.m. when I stepped out onto the front porch of my modest two-story home in Brookridge Hills. The morning air still had a chill to it despite the encroaching summer heat. I had a hot cup of coffee in one hand and a thick envelope in the other. The letter had come from the VA, a follow-up on my upcoming evaluation, but before I could sit and open it, I heard the click of heels on concrete. Click, click, click. That was the sound I had grown to recognize after 6 months of living in the neighborhood. The sound of Karen. No, not just any Karen, HOA Karen as we came to call her. She was the president of the Brookridge Hills Homeowners Association, a self-appointed neighborhood watchdog who treated the quiet cul-de-sac like her personal fiefdom. If a flower pot was out of regulation size, Karen would know. If your garbage bins were left out 10 minutes past collection time, expect a fine. If your lawn dared grow beyond 2.5 inches, well, may the HOA gods have mercy. As she walked up my driveway, in her always polished wedge heels and perfectly ironed beige slacks, clipboard in hand, I knew it wasn't going to be a good morning. "Mr. Dawson," she began, without a greeting. I nodded politely, still holding my coffee, not wanting to make it personal. "You are in violation of HOA Rule 7-C, she declared. "Porch usage. No lounging permitted unless it is after 6 p.m. on weekdays, and only with regulation furniture." I blinked. I looked down at my porch chair, an old hand-sanded rocker that had belonged to my grandfather, passed down to me when I returned from my second tour overseas. Nothing flashy, no neon lights, just a wooden chair and a flagpole behind me. "Karen," I said calmly, "I'm not sure sitting with a cup of coffee qualifies as lounging, and this chair is a family heirloom." She flipped through her paperwork like she was reviewing a case file at a Supreme Court hearing. "No exceptions noted for heirlooms. This is your third infraction. One more, and the board will move forward with an official penalty notice." "Karen," I interrupted softly, "I moved here for peace. You've fined me for the color of my welcome mat. You've cited me for planting tomatoes. Now I'm not allowed to sit on my own porch in the morning." She pursed her lips. "The rules are for everyone, Mr. Dawson. You're not above them." No, I wasn't above them. I'd spent 10 years in the United States Marine Corps learning the value of order and responsibility. I had served in climates and combat zones most people only heard about in news reports. I believed in community. I believed in structure. But what Karen was enforcing wasn't structure. It was control. She handed me a printed notice and strutted back down my driveway with all the ceremony of a departing monarch. As she left, I finally sat in the chair anyway, sipping from my cup, letting the heat settle my rising frustration. The words on the notice blurred slightly as I stared out into the still neighborhood. I wasn't going to let this turn ugly. I'd seen real conflict. This was suburban theater, but then something shifted. Later that week, I overheard her berating a single mother down the street about her kids' bikes being left near the garage. Another neighbor, a retired teacher with a walking cane, had been reported for having non-conforming wind chimes. These weren't just rules anymore. This was bullying. I decided then it wasn't just about me. The next step, instead of retaliating or escalating, I went to the HOA's next open meeting. I wore a collared shirt, brought printouts of the community charter, and respectfully asked to speak. Karen tried to skip over me on the sign-in sheet, but others, quiet voices who'd long been trampled, encouraged me to take the floor. I spoke not as a rebel, not as a former Marine, but as a neighbor. I shared stories of residents, afraid to decorate for holidays, parents told to repaint their doors, veterans cited for flags too large or garden beds too personal. I wasn't met with applause, but I was met with eyes. People looked at me, really looked. I could feel a change beginning. Karen tried to cut me off. "This isn't on the agenda," she said, voice brittle. But a voice from the back, Mr. Lynn, who rarely spoke at all, called out, "Maybe it should be." That was the spark, a subtle warning. The next day, Karen left a new notice taped to my door. This time it was more aggressive, legal terms, deadlines, possible liens. It was her way of reasserting power. I stood on my porch again that morning, this time in full view. I wasn't in uniform, but I stood straight, coffee in hand, eyes forward like it was roll call, as if I was waiting for something, or someone. And then they came, not with flags or fanfare, but with silent, powerful presence. My old Marine unit, 5 brothers in arms from our local chapter, dressed in uniform, showing up not for a fight but for coffee. We filled the porch quietly. Every one of them had once faced something far more serious than HOA citations. But today they stood beside me, not as a protest, but as a show of unity. Karen watched from across the street, stunned and silent. The clipboard stayed at her side. That day, this wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of something different, a line drawn, not with anger, but with resolve. Unity on the porch, thunder in the boardroom. There was something different in the neighborhood that morning, not in the way things looked, but in the way people walked, in the way they paused before backing out of driveways or waved a little longer at one another. Ever since my old Marine buddies had joined me on my porch, quietly taking seats with their hands around steaming coffee mugs and the calm assurance that only those shaped by fire carry, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. They weren't there to intimidate or provoke. They came simply to support me, to stand beside a fellow Marine in the kind of silent solidarity that needs no explanation. And maybe that was what unnerved Karen most. No laws were broken, no rules technically bent. But what happened that morning, what began with a simple sit-in, was a shift in power, a subtle but unmistakable moment when the neighborhood realized they weren't alone under the scrutiny of one woman's clipboard. For the first time since I'd moved to Brookridge Hills, I watched as neighbors began to emerge from behind their closed blinds and carefully clipped hedges. Across the street, Mrs. Alba, who had long endured Karen's weekly walk-bys with nervous smiles, gave me a wave that lasted longer than usual, as if that small act of acknowledgement carried years of silent frustration. The single mom from down the block, whom Karen had reprimanded over chalk drawings on her driveway, walked past with her kids and nodded, just a simple, grateful nod. And slowly, the whispers began. Not malicious gossip, but shared stories, experiences of unjust warnings, repeated notices over trivial issues, and that ever-looming threat of fines disguised as community standards. A week passed after the porch gathering, and not a single word from Karen. Not a warning, not a visit, not even one of her infamous early morning patrols. It was as if she was regrouping, rethinking, or maybe realizing that her authority, once held together by fear and silence, had started to crumble under the weight of shared resistance. But I knew better than to believe it was over. People like Karen didn't retreat without preparing a counterattack. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, it came. The envelope was thick and stamped with official HOA letterhead. Inside was a detailed list of infractions, not just new ones, but a carefully compiled log dating back to my first day in the neighborhood. My grass had, at one point, measured 1/4 inch over the acceptable limit. My porch light, apparently, had exceeded the HOA's brightness code. Even my mailbox, which I had painted in a subdued navy blue as a tribute to my late grandfather, was non-standard color number 42C. At the bottom of the letter was a demand: either comply within 30 days or face property penalties, including liens and court escalation. I sat at the dining table, rereading each line, not out of confusion, but out of disbelief at the sheer pettiness and dedication it must have taken to compile such a document. It wasn't about rules. It was personal now, an orchestrated campaign to bend me into compliance. But I wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. That evening, I held a small gathering at my home. No formal invitations, no flyers. Just quiet conversations and text messages that passed through the neighborhood. People came, first a trickle, then a stream. Young couples, elderly residents, single parents, veterans and families with kids. I didn't wear a uniform that day. I didn't need to. What mattered was that we came together, not as rebels, not as angry residents looking to break the rules, but as neighbors desperate to reclaim the idea of community from the grip of authoritarian oversight. In the middle of that gathering, we formed a plan. We wouldn't fight fire with fire. We would fight it with the very tools Karen used: process, policy, and presence. One neighbor, a retired civil litigation attorney named Mr. Rowe, offered to review the HOA charter. Another, Julia Ng, had experience in non-profit board governance and pointed out that most HOA bylaws required an election cycle and that Karen technically had overstayed her term. We pooled knowledge and resources, compiling not just complaints, but documentation, photos, copies of notices, testimonies. And in those hours, what had started as resistance began to transform into reform. A week later, we submitted a formal motion to call for a special HOA meeting, complete with the required signatures. Karen couldn't ignore it. Not legally. She posted a notice, reluctantly announcing the meeting at the community clubhouse, and with it came a quiet undercurrent of tension that crackled in the air like the moments before a summer thunderstorm. The day of the meeting arrived on a hot Saturday afternoon. The community clubhouse, usually reserved for holiday potlucks or birthday parties, was packed wall to wall, more residents than Karen likely expected. The air conditioning couldn't quite keep up with the crowd and the soft hum of overhead. Fans did little to cut through the heat of anticipation. Karen sat at the front with two board members, both of whom, we later discovered, had been appointed by her without a proper vote. Her expression was tight-lipped, a mask of control worn too long and now starting to crack. I stood up when the floor was opened for comments. Not alone. Mr. Rowe stood beside me, documents in hand. Julia Ng had a laptop displaying slideshow slides, summarizing our points. I didn't speak with anger. I spoke with calm clarity. I detailed the pattern of enforcement, the inconsistencies, the overreach, the fines that lacked due process. I asked questions, not accusations. Why were some residents fined for holiday lights while others were not? Why had the board not held open elections in 3 years? Why did community improvements, like a community garden proposal, get rejected without explanation? For once, Karen had no script. She stumbled through defenses citing upholding community values, but with every answer, it became clearer that the board had ceased to serve the community. It served one person's desire for control. By the end of that meeting, the room didn't erupt in cheers. This wasn't a movie, but what happened was far more powerful. Motions were made, votes were taken, new members were nominated, transparency was demanded. And Karen, for the first time in what residents estimated was nearly a decade, faced a challenge to her rule that she could not shrug off with a notice or a threat. Outside, after the meeting, neighbors didn't rush home. They lingered. They talked. Children played in the grass. Parents chatted in groups. The community felt like one again. Not a collection of homes overseen by a board, but people bound by shared purpose and respect. As I stood on my porch that evening, rocking gently in my grandfather's chair, the same old one Karen had once tried to banish, I looked out over the street with a calm I hadn't felt in months. The neighborhood hadn't changed overnight, but we had stopped being afraid. Karen may not have left her post yet, but her days of unchecked power were numbered, and we were just getting started. The audit, the revolt, and the first cracks in the fortress. In the weeks that followed the community meeting, a transformation began to take root in Brookridge Hills, one that didn't happen in grand, sweeping gestures, but rather in quiet, deliberate actions that reverberated through the neighborhood like steady drumbeats before a march. The energy that had once been drained by fear and forced compliance was now pulsing with a kind of revived civic spirit. Neighbors who had once barely nodded to one another began to exchange long conversations on their front lawns. Flags that had been taken down for violating visual harmony codes were hoisted back up, tastefully, respectfully, and legally. Children's sidewalk chalk no longer disappeared under sudden rainstorms, mysteriously tied to Karen's morning strolls. And me, I kept my routine. Every morning, coffee in hand, I sat on my porch in that same wooden rocker, not as an act of defiance anymore, but simply because I could, and that simple right, that small freedom, had been reclaimed. But for every quiet victory we experienced, there was still the matter of the HOA's foundation, one that Karen had spent years fortifying through obscure bylaw adjustments, selective interpretations of the charter, and a network of hand-picked allies who benefited from her iron grip in subtle ways. The road ahead wasn't just about reclaiming fairness, it was about peeling back layers of bureaucracy to expose the system that had allowed one person to manipulate an entire community under the guise of preserving standards. It was Julia, ever meticulous and tireless, who discovered the discrepancies first. She had obtained financial records from the HOA's treasurer, an elderly man named Warren, who had served dutifully but admitted he had mostly been following Karen's instructions for years. Julia and Mr. Rowe pored over years of transactions, tracing line items, noting irregular spending patterns, and cross-checking expenses labeled community enhancement that never seemed to result in anything tangible. Thousands of dollars were listed as contractor fees, yet no actual improvements had been made. Landscaping budgets had increased annually, yet the same patches of grass looked no different. And the most questionable, an ongoing monthly payout to a consultant whose name didn't match any licensed vendor in the state registry. The audit wasn't just revealing, it was damning. It was no longer a matter of Karen being overbearing. It was about the possibility that the community had been financially misled for years. But we had to be careful. Accusations, especially those tied to money, needed to be handled with clarity and evidence. So we compiled a report, a thick binder filled with annotated receipts, comparative budgets, and minutes from board meetings that contradicted official financial disclosures. With this in hand, we filed a formal grievance through the county's Department of Housing and Community Affairs. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't public, it was procedural, and that was important. We weren't here to stir chaos, we were here to restore integrity, and still Karen didn't step down. Word began to spread that she was doubling down, calling emergency board meetings, rewriting clauses in the HOA charter to grant the board more discretionary powers during times of internal community disputes. It was an obvious attempt to tighten control, just as it was slipping from her grasp. But something had shifted too profoundly now. The residents no longer took her memos as gospel. When one woman on the next street over received a citation for the color of her garden fence, she didn't pay the fine. She knocked on Julia's door and asked for help filing an appeal. When an elderly couple was threatened with yard maintenance fees due to leaves on their driveway, 3 neighbors swept it clean before sunset. People weren't isolating anymore, they were connecting. Then came the final catalyst. One morning, I received a visit from Warren, the longtime treasurer. He was visibly shaken, hands trembling slightly as he held a sealed envelope. "I can't do this anymore," he said. his voice thick with a mix of regret and relief. Inside the envelope were emails, internal correspondence between Karen and her closest board allies. Some of it confirmed what we already suspected: the financial irregularities, the election term violations, and a deliberate effort to keep the board insular by avoiding open nominations. But one email stood out more than the rest. In it, Karen admitted to delaying repair projects in less visible parts of the neighborhood because the residents in those homes don't contribute anything worthwhile to the community. That one line cut deeper than fines or citations ever could. It revealed what lay beneath her obsession with standards: a prejudice, a bias, a belief that some neighbors were less deserving of respect or dignity than others based on their status, lifestyle, or economic contribution. And that was something no one, no matter how much authority they claimed, could justify. We called for another meeting, this time backed by the legal counsel of Mr. Rowe, supported by formal signatures from over 60% of homeowners, and accompanied by a petition to initiate a vote of no confidence. The rules were clear. Under the HOA's own bylaws, if a majority of homeowners submitted such a petition, an emergency vote could be triggered to dissolve and reconstitute the board. Karen fought it, of course. She filed a counterclaim, alleging harassment and attempting to block the vote with an injunction. But her influence was waning. The very same residents she once used to maintain her grip were stepping back, distancing themselves, or outright switching sides. The consultant listed in the HOA books turned out to be her nephew, the landscaping company owned by her brother-in-law. The paper trail had become a noose of her own making. On the day of the vote, the clubhouse was even more crowded than the last time. People stood shoulder to shoulder, many holding copies of the report, others wearing pins that simply read, "Brookridge." Not bureaucracy. It was tense, yes, but it was also civil, respectful, and above all, unified. When the final tally came in, it was overwhelming. 82% voted in favor of dissolving the existing board. Karen didn't speak as she left the clubhouse that evening. She didn't storm out. She didn't shout or threaten legal action. She simply walked to her car, her clipboard tucked under her arm, and drove away without looking back. The neighborhood didn't erupt in celebration. There were no fireworks or loud parties. Instead, there was a quiet exhale, a collective sigh of relief that settled over the streets like a warm breeze after a storm. That night, as the porch lights flickered on, one by one, I found myself surrounded again, not by Marines this time, but by neighbors, people who had become more than just adjacent homeowners, people who had come together to reclaim their community, not through conflict, but through conviction. The battle was over, but the work of rebuilding had only just begun. The reconstruction of trust and the spirit of the street. The weeks that followed Karen's quiet departure from the Brookridge Hills HOA board weren't marked by dramatic change, but that was precisely the point. What came instead was a steady, deliberate process of rebuilding, less like a revolution and more like healing after years of slow erosion. There were no grand speeches or banners hung across the entrance to the neighborhood, no victory laps or boasts. What emerged instead was something far more powerful and enduring, a collective commitment to making the neighborhood feel like a community again. And it began not from the top, but from the porches, sidewalks, and backyards, where neighbors started reclaiming the ordinary as something extraordinary. One of the first things we did once the board was dissolved and restructured with temporary oversight was establish a resident-led transition team. Julia Ung was elected chairperson, not by appointment, not by backdoor agreement, but by a transparent, open vote. Mr. Rowe served as legal advisor, not because he wanted influence, but because he believed in accountability, and to my surprise, they asked me to serve as liaison for community outreach. I accepted, not because I wanted a title, but because I knew how important it was for people to see someone who had once been targeted now playing a central role in rebuilding trust. The transition team's first order of business was simple. Listen. For too long, the residents had lived under an environment where opinions didn't matter unless they aligned with Karen's version of order. So we held listening sessions, not formal meetings, but informal backyard gatherings, small evening meetups where people could share what they loved about Brookridge Hills, what they wanted to see change, and what they feared might return. And the stories we heard were illuminating. Some residents had lived in fear of Karen's arbitrary fines for so long that they'd stopped decorating for holidays. Others shared how their kids were told not to ride bikes near the clubhouse because it was against regulations. There was a quiet grief in many voices, over years spent tiptoeing through what should have been the comfort of home. But there was also hope. One retired teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, suggested reviving the old block parties the community used to host before Karen began requiring costly event permits. A group of younger parents offered to organize weekend cleanups where families could volunteer together to refresh shared spaces instead of relying on inflated landscaping contracts. A high school student even proposed setting up a digital newsletter so that every resident, young and old, could stay informed about developments without needing to sift through confusing legal memos or intimidating notices. Slowly but surely, Brookridge Hills began to take on a different rhythm. One afternoon, I passed by the community garden plot, a neglected patch that had once been shut down by Karen for being unsightly, and found two families clearing it together. They had brought their own tools, mulch, and starter plants. No one asked for permission. No one waited for a committee. They just acted together because it was the right thing to do. That garden soon flourished, not just with tomatoes and sunflowers, but with signs that read, "Take what you need, share what you can." It became a place where neighbors left herbs, extra peppers, even baked goods. Something as humble as a garden had become the heartbeat of the street. The porch I had once been told to vacate became a kind of symbol for the new era, though not by my doing. It was the neighbors who began referring to it as base camp, half jokingly at first. Someone even left a small wooden sign at my steps that read, "Freedom sits here." I didn't remove it, I let it stay. And I made it a habit to keep a spare folding chair nearby, because someone always stopped by. An elderly man needing to rest on his walk, a young mom pushing a stroller, a delivery worker pausing for a quick chat. That chair wasn't just for comfort, it was a statement. This place belongs to all of us. Meanwhile, the restructured HOA board, now filled with balanced elected members, worked under new bylaws that emphasized transparency and equity. Meetings were recorded and shared openly. Decisions were put to community vote. Financial records were posted monthly, down to the dollar. We discovered just how much had been squandered under Karen's leadership, but we also found hope in the clarity of finally knowing where things stood. With careful management and volunteer-led initiatives, we saved enough money within the first 3 months to reduce annual dues by nearly 18%. That reduction wasn't just about finances, it was a symbolic gesture, proving that leadership rooted in fairness could benefit everyone. And yet, even as we built forward, the question of Karen remained. Not because anyone wanted to hold a grudge, but because her departure had left a silence that many felt uncertain about. She hadn't been seen around the neighborhood since stepping down. Rumors spread. Some said she had moved, others claimed she was regrouping to challenge the board legally. But for most residents, her absence wasn't about punishment or relief. It was about reflection. The truth is, Karen wasn't just a villain. To be ousted, she was a symptom of a system that had long favored control over compassion. And if we weren't careful, we could become what we had fought against. So when Julia suggested we host a community reconnection day, I agreed wholeheartedly. Not a celebration of victory, but a day devoted to rebuilding the human spirit that binds neighbors together. We planned for food trucks, live acoustic music, a storytelling tent where people could share their histories, and a mural wall where residents of all ages could paint what home meant to them. No red tape, no special permits, just people in a shared space, reminding themselves why they chose this neighborhood in the first place. The day arrived with bright skies and the kind of warmth that didn't just come from the sun. People showed up early. Children painted rainbows and bicycles on the mural wall. Elders told stories of how Brookridge had once been filled with potlucks and caroling nights. Even newer residents, who had moved in during the height of Karen's rule, found themselves suddenly connected to something older, deeper, and more human than rules or regulations. That day, for the first time in years, the community didn't feel monitored. It felt alive, and as the event wound down and the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the freshly cleaned park lawn, I saw something unexpected. Karen, standing at the far edge, not with a clipboard, not barking orders, but simply watching. She wore no expression I could fully read, part curiosity, part hesitation. She didn't approach anyone. She didn't speak. But she stood there for a long while, alone, before finally turning and walking away. It wasn't closure, not in the cinematic sense. But maybe that's not what real life offers. What it gave us instead was continuity. The idea that the story of a community is never really finished. It evolves with each choice, each conversation, each small act of kindness that pushes back against fear and silence. Brookridge Hills had once been a neighborhood ruled by rules. Now it was something more. A home woven together by people who had chosen empathy over authority, voice over silence, and unity over division. And the best part, we were just getting started. The legacy of order, the birth of leadership by early autumn, Brookridge Hills had taken on a different tone entirely, less reactionary, more intentional. Gone were the days of walking on eggshells, the passive dread of citations tucked under doormats, or the paranoid need to measure your lawn down to the inch. The air was cooler now, tinged with the scent of turning leaves and distant chimney smoke. It wasn't just a seasonal change, it was a cultural one. Something deeper had taken root in the bones of the community, something stronger than the fear that had once defined it. Mutual respect. And yet, as we rounded the corner into this new era, we were reminded, rebuilding is not just about removing the rotten beams of an old structure. It's about asking hard questions about what gets built in their place. In one of our now regular town hall meetings, held in the same community clubhouse that had once been a stage for control rather than collaboration, Julia raised a powerful point. She stood not with authority, but with clarity as she addressed the residents. We've removed a system that limited us, but what are we replacing it with? And who are we becoming now that we're no longer afraid? The room was quiet, not out of discomfort, but reflection. Because she was right. The storm had passed, but the weathered neighborhood stood at a crossroads. Many of us had been so focused on ousting the overreach of the old HOA that we hadn't given ourselves enough time to envision the shape of the new one. Sure, we had a temporary board, and yes, the immediate damage had been addressed, financial transparency restored, elections reset, enforcement policies rewritten, but governance without direction is no better than tyranny dressed in softer clothes. So we opened the floor, not just to the usual voices, but to those who had never spoken at all. We heard from teenagers, from tenants renting homes, from retirees who had been part of the neighborhood since the early 2000s, and had watched it swing from vibrant to fearful, and now hopeful once again. Once That discussion birthed something unexpected, a charter redesign task force, not composed solely of lawyers and policy wonks, but of a true cross-section of the community. I was invited to serve, not as a leader, but as a representative of the average resident, the father, the veteran, the porch sitter who'd been caught in the storm and stayed standing. And this task force, to our own surprise, didn't start with policies or enforcement structures. We began with values. What did Brookridge Hills believe in? What did we want to protect, not just through bylaws, but through shared principles? What emerged over the course of that fall was a vision statement, something the neighborhood had never had before. It read, in part, "We believe a neighborhood is more than homes. It is the shared promise of dignity, belonging, and compassion. Our rules will reflect not fear of difference, but respect for the shared spaces we all steward." This became the heartbeat of every clause we reviewed. From fence regulations to quiet hours, from landscaping standards to porch decor, each rule was questioned not for how it served the board, but how it served the people. Meanwhile, the cultural ripple effects of our community's transformation reached beyond policy. On Saturday morning, I was walking toward the clubhouse when I noticed something odd. A group of teenagers, not misbehaving or loitering, but repainting the wooden benches that lined the main walkway. They had brought their own paint, their own brushes. One of them, a boy named Malik, whose family had once been fined for flying a heritage flag, nodded at me and said, "We figured if adults can clean up the HOA, we can at least fix these." That same week, a few of the younger parents coordinated a neighborhood babysitting cooperative offering flexible mutual childcare without relying on expensive services. A few veterans, including myself, began hosting free weekend workshops for basic home repairs, fixing leaky faucets, replacing light fixtures, sealing windows, all the tasks that can feel overwhelming to new homeowners. The community garden, once just a symbol, now produced real sustenance. Extra vegetables were donated weekly to the local shelter, and perhaps most moving of all was the decision to convert the unused HOA storage shed into a free corner, a tiny wooden hut where people could leave books, toys, non-perishable food, or coats during winter. It had no lock, it had no rules, it never needed them, but with progress always comes echoes of the past. One evening in mid-October, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, neat, cold. It was from Karen. The letter wasn't bitter or angry, it was short, formal. "I see the neighborhood has changed. I hope it lasts. I only ever wanted to protect it, though I understand now that fear is not protection. Perhaps I stayed too long in charge, or perhaps I lost track of what made the community worth protecting. Either way, I won't return, but I hope you keep the place in better shape than I did." There was no name signed, just her initials. KLI sat with that letter for a long time, not out of confusion but contemplation. Karen had been many things: rigid, authoritarian, obsessed with control, but she had also been a neighbor, one who had once believed she was doing the right thing. Her methods were flawed, deeply. But in that letter was something most people never expect from someone like her: remorse. I didn't share it with the neighborhood, not yet. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I believed some things needed time before they could be understood. Leadership isn't just about standing at the front when the path is clear. It's about holding the line when everything is messy, uncertain, even painful. In the military, I learned that command isn't earned through loud orders, but quiet trust. And now, here in the quiet lanes of Brookridge Hills, I was seeing that lesson come full circle. We were not just survivors of Karen's HOA, we were authors of something new, and every meeting, every painted bench, every seed planted in the garden reminded us, rules don't make a community, people do. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the neighborhood didn't just live in our addresses or our deeds. It lived in our actions, in how we looked out for each other, in how we built together, not from fear but from faith in one another. The long porch, the shared morning, and the future we built winter in Brookridge Hills arrived not as a disruption, but as a quiet punctuation mark on a year that had reshaped every corner of the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the trees stripped bare, and yet for the first time in many winters, the community did not feel cold. Walks were taken more slowly. Porch lights glowed longer in the evenings. Snow-covered lawns, once a battleground for HOA-approved heights and shoveling compliance, became canvases for snowmen and impromptu snowball games. The icy silence that had once defined the streets was gone, replaced by something warmer, more human, the hum of shared life. And amid it all, I found myself once again on my porch, just as I had been in the beginning. Same rocker, same mug, but a very different world around me. This wasn't the chair of quiet resistance anymore. It had become a place of welcoming. Neighbors dropped by, not to check in out of concern, but to talk, to laugh, to share something. A plate of cookies, a piece of local gossip, a child's report card beaming with pride. I never imagined that a porch, just wood and nails and memories, could become a symbol, but that's exactly what it had become. A symbol of what we chose to protect and how we did it. As the final touches of our community charter were being ratified, the neighborhood voted unanimously to adopt a new foundational initiative, the Porchlight Project. Its idea was simple. Every home would be encouraged, never required, to leave their porch light on once a week, symbolizing that they were a safe space, a neighbor who could be counted on, a friend in case someone needed help, comfort, or company. It wasn't monitored, it wasn't enforced, and that's why it worked. Trust, after all, cannot be mandated. It must be offered freely and received without fear. One of the most profound changes came in a place no one expected: the mailboxes. Under Karen's administration, mailboxes had been tightly regulated. Size, shape, color, even the flower bed around them had to meet specifications. But with the new board, we held a mailbox makeover weekend. What resulted wasn't chaos, it was art. Each mailbox became a small expression of its household, handprints of children, tributes to veterans, floral designs, favorite quotes. One was painted to resemble a stack of books, another shaped like a miniature barn. Instead of making the neighborhood look inconsistent, it made it look lived in, unique, real. No one got fined. Everyone got complimented. That winter also marked the first time the community hosted its own Festival of Lights, a holiday event where every culture, every tradition was not just welcomed, but celebrated. The Singh family hosted a Diwali booth. The Rodriguez family brought tamales and candles. The Wangs displayed their lanterns, and I shared hot cider under a canvas tent strung with old Marine Corps lights I'd salvaged from storage. There was no competition for best decorated home, no list of approved color schemes, only shared warmth, food, laughter, and children weaving from yard to yard with glowing sticks and sticky fingers. But the moment that stays with me most happened on a morning just after New Year's. The snow was heavy that day, the kind that fell in large, slow flakes. I was on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood stir awake beneath its white blanket. And then I saw her, Karen, not standing, not inspecting, but walking slowly, alone, coat zipped tight, head down. She paused briefly across the street, in front of the community garden, the one she had once closed for being an eyesore. It was snow-covered now, the beds empty, the benches frosted over. But she stood there a long while. I thought about calling out, offering a wave, but I didn't, not out of resentment, but respect. There are some moments people need to have with themselves. That one belonged to her. She didn't linger long. She turned, walked back the way she came, and disappeared from view. I haven't seen her since. Later that day, I spoke with Julia, who quietly confirmed that Karen had officially sold her home. No fanfare, no announcements, just a quiet exit. In her place, a young couple moved in, first-time homeowners, kind, eager, a little overwhelmed. They came by to introduce themselves, nervously asking if the porch chair was a neighborhood landmark. I laughed and said no, but then paused. Actually, yeah, I added. It kind of is. By spring, we had completed what once felt impossible, the full transformation of the HOA. Elections were now staggered and term-limited. Enforcement was educational, not punitive. Disputes went through mediation, not immediate fines. We had transparency, not secrecy. But most importantly, we had found our identity, not as rebels, not as regulators, as neighbors. In my garage, I still keep the original violation notice Karen handed me. That morning she demanded I get off my porch. It's yellowed now, folded, worn at the edges. I don't keep it as a trophy. I keep it as a reminder that the cost of silence is often greater than the risk of standing up. That change doesn't always come with banners and noise. Sometimes it comes with a rocking chair, a warm cup of coffee, and the courage to say, this isn't right, and I'm not alone. We didn't change Brookridge Hills overnight. We changed it one moment at a time, one voice, one neighbor, one story at a time. And when the world felt too complicated, too adversarial, too full of noise, we found peace in the simple act of sitting together and listening. The porch still stands, and now it belongs to all of us.